post-war Russian history, of course, is going to be characterized by Russia's engagement now with the rest of the world, and in particular in this bipolar relationship that it will have with the United States and the various alliances, NATO versus Warsaw Pact. And so it becomes, after the Second World War, difficult to disengage from Russia's external history, because it so much will affect the internal as well. And when we look at the Cold War, which of course will define for us the understanding we have of Russia and Russia's history, it's essentially a lesson in international relations. And although this course is not really about Russia's foreign policy, it's hard to separate the two, and remain so to this day. And so I'll take you through, we have to go back a little bit into the Second World War to look at how Russia was engaged with the other great powers during the war, and what kind of expectations, as you see in this illustrated cartoon from Crocodile magazine, or in fact, I think it was Ogonyok, the kind of Life magazine, Russian Life magazine version of that publication, where we see Russia being ready to embark on this voyage into 1946. And certainly it's a hopeful vision that the Russians have of what the future is going to look like, and it's one that is optimistic in the relationships that Russia imagines it's going to have with Britain and the United States. One has to realize that much of Russia's expectations and the West's expectations of Russia is going to be based on the agreements that the so-called Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, will have of each other and of the post-war world. There will be three major conferences where the leaders of these countries will come together, and essentially they will hammer out the shape of our world as we know it today. These conferences are the Tehran Conference in Iran, held between the 28th of November and 1st of December 1943. The very much important Yalta Conference in February of 1945, and then the final conference at Potsdam in Germany in July, August of 1945. By then, interestingly enough, Stalin is the only one remaining in power of the Big Three. Roosevelt, of course, had died in April of 1945 before the war ended, and Truman, his vice president, has taken this place, while Churchill, in the middle of the Tehran Conference, in the middle of the Potsdam Conference, comes back to Britain to face elections, and the British vote him out of office. Quite a kind of a cold decision by the people of Britain. I guess not wanting a wartime prime minister, in office now that peace is coming. And of course, Winston Churchill is going to be replaced by Clement Attlee at Potsdam. Tehran, Iran, is picked as a conference to essentially please Stalin, who doesn't fly. He's afraid of flying. It's, of course, 1943. Russia is in the middle of this life or death battle. Stalin doesn't want to leave any great distance away from Russia or Moscow, and Iran is under U.S. and British control and Russian control at this point. And so they decide that it will be safe for them, all the three world leaders now, to meet in Iran. Roosevelt and Churchill have already met, but this will be and if I'm not mistaken, Churchill and Stalin have already met, but they've not come together as all three. And this, in fact, is the first face-to-face meeting of a sitting president and a sitting ruler of Russia, where Stalin and Roosevelt will meet each other at this conference. All three agree on the future of Germany, that it has to cease to exist. Churchill's position is certainly Germany should be broken down into its pre-Second Reich state, the pre-Bismarck era state, into all these various unconfederated principalities. Churchill feels that really who's at fault in terms of Germany's aggressive behavior, both in the First World War and the Second World War, and I guess the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, are the Prussians. And Churchill certainly feels the Prussians are of a different personality than the rest of Germany. And indeed, there are kind of fundamental cultural differences, say, between Bavarians and Prussians, more or less similar, say, in Canada, the difference between Ontarians and Quebecois. They are really different cultures, right down to the difference between kind of a Protestant ascendancy in Ontario and a Catholic one in Quebec. Bavaria, southern Bavaria, is mostly Catholic. Prussia, of course, is mostly Protestant. That, of course, doesn't stop Hitler from emerging out of Bavaria. That's the Nazi Party's home base and where Hitler settled when he left Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and took up residence in Bavaria shortly before the First World War. The Americans, Henry Morgenthau in particular, FDR's Secretary of Treasury, want to also destroy essentially Germany's industrial base and their war-making capability. The Morgenthal Plan calls for the separation of the industrial north of Germany from the agricultural south, essentially a disassembly of industry in northern Germany, deindustrialization, and again, essentially destruction of the German nation. Parts of Germany were going to be given over to Poland. Other parts of Germany, particularly on the borders of other European Western countries, Belgium, Netherlands, would become an international zone, and the Germans would essentially be reduced to becoming an agrarian farming people. And Morgenthau will later outline his plan in his book, Germany is Our Problem, a plan for Germany. So the Morgenthau Plan essentially sees a Germany partitioned and gone. Not that far in terms of the future that Churchill sees for Germany. Again, a partition back to its pre-Confederate, Germany confederated in 1871, to its pre-Confederate principalities, where Germany consisted of dozens and dozens of independent principalities. So let's just divide up Germany and deindustrialize it, is Morgenthal's plan. Stalin wants to even go back further. Stalin refers to his plans for Germany as the breaking down of Germany into its original tribes. Stalin essentially is looking to pre-Treaty of Westphalia pre-Westphalian Germany before 1648. So again, a kind of breaking down of Germany to its kind of primitive roots. In any case, all three agree that the last two world wars and the 20th century, essentially up until 1945, had been shaped by German aggression, by the threat of Germany, and that Germany needs to be eliminated now as a threat. And Russia, of course, having experienced what they experienced, is looking forward to the British, the Americans, and the Russians all working together to administrate a future Germany, perhaps for the next century, for the next 100 years. And Stalin is counting on that for his sense of security. Stalin and Roosevelt, although this is the first time they're meeting personally, unlike Churchill, who came to power in 1940, Stalin and Roosevelt, Stalin has been in power the longest, since the late 1920s. Roosevelt, of course, wins the 1932 election and has been in power since being inaugurated in 1933. And one of the first things, as you might remember from a previous lecture, Roosevelt and Stalinist Russia established diplomatic relations. They have interests, remember, in China, and in particularly the kind of aggressive position Japan is taking on American and Russian joint interests in Manchuria and access to the Chinese market. So essentially, the US and Russia have been working together without the two leaders necessarily meeting each other, but they have cordial relations. And much needs to be settled for both the Russians and Americans in terms of what the Japanese are doing there. And so we'll see that once Roosevelt meets Stalin at Tehran in 1943, they develop this, very close-minded and mutually agreeable relationship. They like each other. They kind of share a sense of humor. Often they talk and meet without Churchill. In fact, sometimes they'll make jokes to each other. Well, let's do this, but don't tell Winston. And so the two of them just hit it off right away. One of the first things, when you look at the Yalta transcripts of the minutes of the conference, one of the first things that Roosevelt and Stalin talk about is about Russian-American trade and how good it will be once the war is over. Stalin tells Roosevelt that he's looking forward to American companies importing consumer goods into Russia, that Russia, through its 5-year plans throughout the 1930s, has developed a very heavy industrial base, but it doesn't have a consumer industry, but it has an overabundance of natural resources. And both of them agree that this is a basis for very good economic relations in the future. American consumer goods in exchange for these reserves of abundant natural resources, oil and gold and so forth, that the Russians have. So they're looking forward to a economic future that's very rosy and certainly compatible with both the American and the Russian economic situation. In particular, Roosevelt is aware that he has managed to essentially take the United States out of the Depression thanks to the Second World War. And, America begins to climb, the United States begins to climb out of its depression as American factories start producing goods for the war effort by the British prior to the United States entering the war. Lend-Lease is the program, and Roosevelt realizes that this abundance of employment and corporate wealth that the United States is accumulating in the production of arms for the Second World War is going to be endangered the moment that war comes to an end. Roosevelt, of course, anticipates mass unemployment in the United States. This is historically the situation often after wars. Certainly it was the situation for Britain after the Napoleonic Wars, as the factories begin to slow down and people are out of work. So this boom would be, of course, would be heaven sent to be producing products, and those factories continuing to work, selling now consumer goods to the vast market of Russia. And as well, Roosevelt, with the defeat of Japan, is counting on that elusive Chinese market as well. And so you see this cartoon, for example, appear just how close and cozy Roosevelt and Stalin are. I'm glad you dug up your constitution, Joe. I can't find ours. And of course, this harks back to two things. In the middle of those awful Great Terror arrests of the 1930s, Stalin had introduced a new Russian constitution, which guaranteed the freedom of speech, the freedom of voting, all these constitutional guarantees that Stalin, completely ignored and violated in what he did at home in Russia. Roosevelt, likewise, is charged with violating the American Constitution. Remember the National Recovery Act, the New Deal was at first ruled by the U.S. Supreme Court as unconstitutional, and Roosevelt goes to war with Supreme Court of the United States, threatening to expand the membership of the courts if the Supreme Court, if the Supreme Court doesn't kind of begin to toe the political and economic policy line that the FDR administration is introducing. And indeed, the Supreme Court backed down. So it left kind of a bad taste in the mouths of Americans and certainly Roosevelt opponents, that Roosevelt kind of attacks the Supreme Court very much as the situation we might be facing in the near future of the United States. Although unless the Democrats get a Senate majority, it may be difficult for them to change the number of justices on the Supreme Court, although they certainly have that option. It is open if the Supreme Court becomes too sort of Republican dominated. Roosevelt at least threatened to do so and was prepared to do so. So, as I say, there is this kind of affinity, even in terms of the two constitutions at home being challenged by these leaders. So, apropos China, the United States, of course, is supporting this warlord, Chiang Kai-Shek, In China, Chiang Kai-Shek is fighting not only the Japanese in Manchuria, but often, rather than fighting the Japanese, he's also fighting his ally Mao Zedong. And Stalin immediately promises Roosevelt that he will continue supporting Chiang Kai-Shek. Um, Stalin doesn't like communists that are not, quote, his communists, and Mao Zedong certainly came without Russian help. He emerged as very much a warlord in the same way Chiang Kai-shek emerges, defeating his fellow warlords, and emerges without essentially much Russian help. And so even though Mao Zedong kind of shares the same ideology with Stalin, you know, that's not going to stop Stalin. Stalin, in fact, kills more communists than he'll kill non-communists in his history. And Stalin promises that he will continue his support for Chiang Kai-shek. And whatever communication he has with Mao, he pressures Mao to continue his alliance with Chiang Kai-shek against the Japanese. And so the Chinese resistance, the Chinese Republic under Chiang Kai-shek, becomes kind of the official representative of China and is an ally of both the United States and Russia and Britain in the Second World War in their fight against the Japanese. Even though in the middle of this fight against the Japanese, Chiang Kai-shek occasionally turns on his communist allies under Mao Zedong, and there are all these massacres of Chinese communist guerrillas and field armies by Chiang Kai-shek, while the Japanese just stand by without engaging the Republic's army. In any regards, certainly Stalin is in line with Roosevelt's interests. As I say, they have joint interests in China. And so there's no ground for disagreement over China. Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill agree on the establishment of a new international organization to replace the failed League of Nations. The failure of the League of Nations to essentially prevent a Second World War, which was the purpose of the League of Nations, is its strange kind of procedural basis for challenging an aggressor. Before the League of Nations can engage an aggressor to protect a member state subject to aggression, for example, the way China was by the Japanese in the 1930s, or Abyssinia, Ethiopia by the Italians, League of Nations was not able to do anything because a majority vote, in fact, more than a majority vote, a unanimous vote was necessary for the League of Nations to act. And so in the international political world, never in the League's history were the great powers of that era all unanimous in their condemnation of another power. And so that's how Italy and Japan managed to get away with doing what they did without the League of Nations engaging it. And so new rules and the formation of the United Nations is agreed upon in Tehran. The Allies, who actually one of the formal names for the Allies, or the Grand Alliance, is going to be actually the United Nations. And so the main allied party, China, UK, USA, and USSR, it is agreed, will now become permanent members of a Security Council. And there will be temporary members elected every few years to the Security Council, but the China, UK, USA, and USSR will have unlike in the League of Nations, will have veto power. And so these four countries now, it's not necessary any longer to have a consensus of all nations to act. One only needs the Security Council to pass a resolution with a simple majority without China, UK, or USA or USSR vetoing it. And so that's how all the countries of the world begin to agree that, certainly a country like New Zealand does not have the kind of strategic interests in import the way the USA might or the USSR might. And so that these great powers need to have a veto over anything the United Nations can do to protect their interests. And therefore, the United Nations can become, indeed as it will be, a functioning, viable organization. You may notice that France, which has a veto power today, is completely missing out of this. In fact, France is in the enemy list. There, the major powers of the enemy are Germany, Japan, and Italy, the Axis or the tripartite pact nations, and then all the associated allies, Bulgaria, Finland, France. Remember, Vichy France is an ally of Germany and the French when they were defeated in the invasion in the Western Blitzkrieg of 1940, immediately switched sides and joined the Germans, de Gaulle being one of the few Frenchmen who chose to fight on and eventually went into exile in London, from where he led his organization. Hungary is a Nazi ally, Iraq is, Romania, Thailand, and a whole list of countries that become part of the Axis enemy. France, as I say, is going to be a huge problem, and we'll see what happens to France later in this lecture. But again, Marshal Pétain, the great hero of the First World War, becomes the head of state, the president of a Nazi France. And Pierre Laval, a right-wing parliamentary politician, becomes the prime minister. And Vichy France now, its official capital is in Paris, but of course Paris is under German occupation and will remain so. They move temporarily their capital to Vichy in the south of France, where the Germans allowed the French to have their own territory. And in fact, unlike the Poles, for example, who sailed their navy to Britain, and the Poles as well go into exile in London, the French refuse to sail their navy away as the Nazi military is beginning to take custody of the French navy. And so the British have to sink the French fleet in the Mediterranean and kill a whole bunch of French having to do that. That's a decision that Churchill makes, rather than allowing the French Navy to fall into German hands. In fact, it's in Algeria that French fleet is sunk in the Mediterranean, July 3rd, 1940. Here you can see that the German occupy the entire coastal region, Atlantic region of France, but Vichy France will self-administrate in the south, in the pink area there. And Italy will also occupy the bordering region, Nice, Menton, and so forth, Grenoble, on the Italian border. The French also are allowed by the Germans to keep and administrate French Morocco, Algeria, what's known generally as French West Africa and French North Africa. The Italians, of course, control Libya. And that's why in that movie Casablanca, there's all this stuff going on in Morocco and Casablanca. Humphrey Bogart. There's these French officers, and yet they're working with Nazis in that movie. That's kind of the background to the true politics of what inspired the movie Casablanca. And so when the Allies make their first landing against German forces, they're going to make it in North Africa, Operation Torch, in November of 1942. And so when American forces land on the beaches of French Africa, the beaches of Morocco, Algeria, they essentially have to fight their way through the French army. It's the Germans are not there. It's the French who are defending Hitler's Africa Corps, which is at this point fighting in Libya and Egypt, the British Eighth Army, as the Americans kind of land in North Africa to try to outflank the Africa Corps. The French do all the fighting, protecting the Nazis. And here you can see the French in North Africa throwing a very nice Hitler salute as they're being inspected by French officers. Over 1,000 Americans are killed by the French army. Now the French fight for the first time in their life in the Second World War. And it's a bitter fight against essentially French fascism for the Americans. And de Gaulle, of course, is the one exception. De Gaulle had left France the moment France surrendered, and de Gaulle, in fact, is considered a traitor by the official French government at that time for disobeying orders and continuing to fight against the Germans. And de Gaulle ends up making propaganda broadcasts into France from London, and he forms the Free French movement that Churchill sponsors. But de Gaulle, of course, is just a small renegade army, while most of France, as I say, has gone towards the German side. De Gaulle has Churchill as his sponsor and protector. And Churchill is going to be obviously throughout the war trying to position de Gaulle in a way that de Gaulle's France will emerge at the end of the war under de Gaulle's control, and of course compatible with British Churchillian policy as well at the same time. So they're certainly partnered up. The problem is Roosevelt, of course, cannot forgive the French for what they did in North Africa, for killing all those Americans. And you can just see from the body language, Roosevelt just thinks de Gaulle stinks, and all the French stink. He is not fond of France now. Russia as well is maybe doesn't have any kind of bitterness towards France, as of course all that occurred while the Soviet Union was an ally of Germany still in 1940. But Stalin is essentially disinterested. And the one thing that Roosevelt and Stalin agree upon is that France will be treated in the same way as Germany. It's as an enemy state. It's going to be stripped of its navy. Its navy is going to be scrapped. It will be stripped of its major aggressive arms. It will be reduced from a great power to not a great power. And moreover, both Roosevelt and Churchill, um, both Roosevelt and Stalin agreed that French colonies will be stripped of France. Roosevelt already has his eye on Indochina, which, Cambodia and Vietnam. And those were French colonies that the French handed over, particularly Vietnam, they handed over to the Japanese. And so Stalin and Roosevelt are like-minded on the future of France. It's not going to be a great power in the future and will be treated as an enemy and decolonized. And here, for example, Roosevelt and Stalin kind of joke, well, but let's not tell Winston, because of course both of them realized that stripping a great power of its colonies after the Second World War is going to be opposed by the British, who have all these colonial interests, particularly India, as India has a strong independence movement. The British have all these colonies in the Pacific and in Africa, and so Churchill would never agree to a decolonization of France. So this is something that, even though it's in the official transcripts, Roosevelt and Stalin kind of low key when it comes to Churchill. The Russians as well at Tehran agree that they are going to launch a major offensive, which will become known as Operation Bagration, in June of 1944, when the Allies land in Europe. And in fact, they agreed that this is going to happen in May of 1944. There weather delays on the operations in Normandy, in what's going to become known as D-Day. That, of course, will be June 6th, 1944. And that's essentially the same time that the Russians coordinate their assault on Germany from the east. A much, much more extensive and broader operation than certainly Operation Overlord was at Normandy. And Stalin has been begging for the opening of the Second Front for years now. In fact, Stalin is quite shocked that when the Allies announced that they've opened the Second Front, it was with Operation Torch, the landing in North Africa. And Stalin is like, what's that about? Churchill is arguing that, this is our attack into Germany through the soft underbelly of Italy. Which is nonsense, because, of course, anybody who's traveled through Italy realizes that, Italy is not a soft underbelly. In fact, it's a tough, mountainous region, not exactly vulnerable to infantry movement or armor and so forth. And Stalin realizes that Churchill actually is cynically pushing this Second Front into North Africa, because Churchill is more worried about losing the Suez Canal, and he wants to eject the German threat in Egypt, in Libya, that is advancing towards the Suez Canal, which is essential, of course, for the road to India and for all sorts of military reasons, always has been for the entire century that it had existed. And that's essentially what the war in North Africa is about, to keep the Germans from seizing the Suez Canal. And so they agree now that May 44, this operation, there will be this landing in Europe, and it happens in June, and Operation Bagration gets off the ground at that point. Stalin also makes a commitment that within 3 months of Germany's defeat, Russia will declare war against Japan and attack the Japanese in Manchuria, which they will, and that, of course, will place the Russians into Korea as well, which is at this point just a province of Japan. Japan had just outright annexed Korea. It's considered as a Japanese province, and so that will position the Russians, in fact, right into North Korea, as the Americans are going to come up from South Korea and lay the seeds for the Korean War in 1950. Another issue it brought up at Tehran is a revision of the Turkish Straits Agreement, the Montreux Convention of 1936. This international agreement, and it's still in force today, gives Turkey control over the Turkish Straits, the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits. It regulates the transit of naval warships. The convention guarantees the free passage of civilian vessels in peacetime, but restricts the passage of naval ships not belonging to the Black Sea states. And that would be Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, and Russia. The Turkish military control over the straits and refortification of the Dardanelles that were fought over in the First World War is now endorsed by this agreement. And it, to the British satisfaction, it restricts Soviet ability to send naval forces into the Mediterranean Sea from the Black Sea at times of war. It satisfies British concerns because of their fear of Soviet intrusion into what is considered a British sphere of influence around Greece and again the entry into the Suez Canal at Egypt. But it as well gives the Russians some benefit in that belligerents against Russia cannot sail into the Black Sea either. And Turkey during the Second World War will remain neutral, and the German Navy is not allowed to sail through the Turkish Straits to deploy in the Black Sea. And so Stalin, however, wants free passage for the Black Sea fleet into the Mediterranean. And he's proposing a kind of joint Soviet-Turkish administration of this passage, of the Dardanelles passages. And basically, Churchill and Roosevelt kind of give positive signals that Russia certainly strategically deserves this access. But they remain vague on exactly when or how it's going to be done. So Stalin gets a kind of positive nod in that direction, but no commitment. And the Russians are still waiting for it to this day, because over the next few years, the British and Americans are just going to stall on the issue of the Dardanelles Straits, and are still stalling to this day. And that's why Crimea is such an issue for the Russians, and has been since the Crimean War of 1850, the 1850s, when Turkey, Britain, and France had attacked the Russians at Crimea. It was about, again, the Russian Black Sea Fleet and its ability to deploy into the Mediterranean. The purpose of it was to bottle up Russia in the Black Sea, and they're still doing it. And it is, as I say, one of these hot issues today for our relations with Putin's Russia. And Crimea, of course, has emerged as this hotspot as the Russians annexed it recently. Here you can see the Istanbul Strait, the narrowest point. And so the Turks, of course, with this kind of narrow character of the straits, can very easily defend those straits from against naval intrusion from the land, from forts built on the coastal line of the straits. The one thing that is beginning to trouble relations between Britain, United States on one side, and the Russians, of course, is Poland. Again, let me review briefly the history. Remember that the Nazis and Stalin's Soviet Union made an alliance. They invaded Poland together, and just Poland was partitioned and destroyed as a country, with the Nazis occupying the western part of Poland and incorporating it into the Third Reich, while the Russians occupied the eastern part of Poland and incorporated it into the Soviet Union. And the Polish government, unlike the French, the Polish government, as I say, withdrew to London under the sponsorship of Churchill. They flew whatever remained of the Polish Air Force. The pilots flew those planes to Britain. Polish soldiers, many of them escaped Poland before the Nazis closed the ring. They would end up, some of them fighting in the French army later in 1940. Others managed to make their way to England. The Polish Navy, its submarines, all left Poland and sailed to safety and joined with the British Navy. And the Polish government continued to function in exile. Officially, it would become known as the Government of the Republic of Poland in Exile. They will have a resistance army that they operate in Poland, known as the AK, the National Army, the Armia Krajowa. They will become essentially nicknamed as the London Poles. And that's kind of the symbol that you see of the Armia Krajowa, that the London Poles operate in Poland. So together, the Russians and Germans partition Poland. And of course, on the Russian side, all these Polish prisoners of war, POWs, end up in Russian captivity. And that happens in 1939, and they're kept in captivity through 1940 and into 1941. Of course, in June of 1941, now the Nazis invade Russia in Operation Barbarossa, and suddenly the Polish Republic in exile, the London Poles, now become an ally of Moscow, in the same way the British do, and I guess de Gaulle's French do, and so forth. And as the Germans are advancing into Russia, Russians now, the Soviets now begin to release Polish POWs. And Polish POWs are exfiltrated now from Russia through Iran, which again is under British, American, Russian control, because the Shah of Iran at that time was very pro-Nazi, and so the Allies seize Iran early in the war and depose the Shah, who's the father of the Shah we're familiar with of the 1950s through the 1970s. But they depose the Shah and essentially establish a government, a republican government in Persia, Iran, and maintain that country under control until after the war. And so Polish POWs are now exfiltrated from the free zones of Russia into Iran, and then from Iran they sail through the Persian Gulf out around Saudi Arabia and eventually up the Suez Canal, where all these Polish soldiers are deployed to fight the Africa Corps in Egypt, at Tobruk in Libya, and then eventually, as the Germans are expelled from North Africa, the Polish Corps will now be deployed into Italy, and they'll fight their way up Italy. They will distinguish themselves, of course, at the Battle of Monte Cassino, and eventually that Polish Corps is going to scoop up my father and grandfather and all my aunts up in northern Italy, and that's how my family gets out of this catastrophic war with this same Polish court. The only problem is the Poles are happy, of course, that all these POWs are released, and the British as well, and the Americans, as they're getting now all these new troops becoming available as the POWs are released. The Poles, though, have one question is, thank you for releasing our POWs, but can you also send us our officers? Most of the POWs are sergeants and corporals and privates. Where are our officers? And Stalin at first stalls them. His first response is, well, let me look into it. Are you sure you've got no officers arriving among our consignments of former POWs? Gosh, we just can't find them. We don't know where they are. And the Poles won't let go. They're now pressing this issue. Where is the Polish Army Officers Corps? And Stalin eventually says, well, it seems like we sent them to China and we lost them somewhere on the Manchurian border. And it's not going well. And of course, as the Germans are advancing, April of 1943, the German army now, in fact, they've uncovered these graves much earlier, but it's in April of 1943 that the Nazis make a decision to make this public and announce that they have discovered all these mass graves of Polish army officers, approximately 12,000. And this, of course, Goebbels decides is a great propaganda coup. Goebbels opens that area to the Red Cross and international inspectors, and the press is invited to come and see this. There is an investigation, as I say, a Swiss neutral investigation that, to Stalin's rage, the London Poles endorse and participate in. And this, of course, the conclusion is that these victims that they uncovered were all executed by the Russian Secret Service, the GRU, the future KGB. And when the Poles endorsed this report, Stalin, of course, says this is fraud, this is fake news. He accuses the Germans of actually committing these murders at Katyn. There at Katyn, just at one location, they find, I think, 12,000 Polish officers with their hands tied behind their backs, shot in the back of the head with Russian munitions. Stalin accuses the Germans of staging these executions, that the Germans had captured these Polish POWs and had executed them using Russian weapons and blamed it on the Russians. And now he accuses the London Poles of collaborating with Nazi Germany and being traitors. And he breaks off diplomatic relations with the London Poles, with the official Republic of Poland government in exile, much to Churchill's chagrin. Churchill, of course, is trying desperately to heal the break between the London Poles and Stalin for the future. Stalin won't have anything to do with it. And Stalin now establishes his own sponsored Polish government in exile, which he says is loyal to the Allies and is against Nazism, the Polish Committee of National Liberation, the PCNL, who become known as the Lublin Poles because of this controlling faction in the PCNL known as the Lublin Committee. And so now you have two rival governments facing each other, the Lublin Poles, sponsored by Stalin, and the London Poles, sponsored by Churchill. And nothing good is going to come of it. And in fact, the roots of the Cold War are, half of them at least, are buried in the future resolution of these two rival groups of exiled Poles. Here you can see Churchill along again. On the left is one of the members of the Polish exile government in Poland. They're just down the hall from Charles de Gaulle, in fact. And as well, Churchill is sponsoring the Czechoslovakian government in exile. Beneš has left Czechoslovakia and is claiming to be the legitimate ruler of Czechoslovakia, which is under Nazi control as a protectorate. The Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia in March of 1939. They dismembered Czechoslovakia without even going to war. The Polish history, of course, is going to be reviewed at Yalta and what the future is. You can see when World War I breaks out, Warsaw is in the Russian Empire. Poland was partitioned in the late 1700s by the Prussians, Austrians, and Russians. The three of them essentially tore Poland apart into three territories that they then incorporated into their own territories, and Poland ceased to exist after the 1700s. When World War I breaks out, you can see Poland's current capital, Warsaw, is still in Russia, as is Lublin, Brest-Litovsk, and so forth. When the Bolsheviks seize power, Lenin, as the price he pays of an armistice with Germany and Russia's exit from the war, Russia gives up all this territory, including Crimea, to the Germans. And this, of course, happens in March of 1918, about 5 months before the end of the First World War. And so the Germans never really get much opportunity to hang on to this territory. They're going to now lose it, but neither are the Russians going to get all of it back. In the Civil War, the Russians managed to get the Ukrainian portions of it. They get Crimea back and so forth. They get parts of Belarusia back. You can see Minsk is near the border on this map of Poland, but Poland now is carved out of this territory, as well as Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, who also were nations of their own and empires of their own. Lithuania often allied with Poland prior to the emergence of Prussia and Imperial Russia's partition of, again, that territory. So all these countries emerge in 1920, and that's the shape of Poland that the Russians are going to invade. So the Russians kind of have a claim on this territory and will have a claim. And so the Germans then take this. The Russians take Poland, and immediately they incorporate that territory, quote, back into Russia. And as well, through 1940, the Russians will take Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And so the future that they decide for Poland is, and certainly Churchill doesn't like it, but he agrees to it. Roosevelt is essentially indifferent to Poland. And so here you can see pre-war Poland. The green is German territory, as it was after the Versailles Treaty, with that Polish corridor leading out to the Baltic Sea. And so now we have the Curzon line, on which the border of Russian-occupied Poland lies. And Stalin demands now that the Curzon line become the new eastern border of Poland, between Poland and Russia. And Churchill keeps, you know, goading Stalin. Every time Stalin says Curzon line, Churchill corrects him, says, "You mean the Molotov-Ribbentrop line?" And Stalin eventually responds to Churchill and says, "Well, you can call it whatever you want, but that's where Russia's border lies, on the Curzon line, which was a line that the British had drawn back in, after the First World War, when Poland was at war at that point now with Russia, and the British were involved in trying to settle that war between Russia and Poland. And Lord Curzon had drawn this line where he thought the British-Russian border would lie. The Poles, by virtue of military strength, managed to go into that gray area, as you see, and so overran the Curzon line. But Stalin now very conveniently says, well, the British recognized this way back in 1919, 1920. That's where we want our border. And in exchange, the former German regions from the 1920s and 1930s of Poland will now be given over to Poland. In other words, they're going to pick Poland up and move it westwards into German territory, like this. And that, in fact, is the current border of Poland and Russia to this day. The London Poles like the part about the western portion being taken from Germany and now incorporated into the Polish new republic. They, however, reject the Curzon line. The London Poles now insist on all this. They want both. In other words, they want their they want their cake and eat it too. And so this further now is going to create problems for the Allies, as the United States and Britain are kind of forced to recognize the Curzon line, but the London Poles continue resisting. And that too is going to now drive a deeper wedge between especially Churchill and Stalin. Churchill, as I say, he hates Hitler just a little bit more than he hates Stalin, but Churchill, of course, hates the Bolsheviks, he hates communism, and has no admiration for Stalin either. But he's faced with the realities here. And so at Tehran and then at Yalta, they will confirm both the eastern and the western border. The new border of Germany and Poland will lie on the Oder-Neisse River, on the Oder River. It becomes known as the Oder-Neisse line, and that will be the border. The German ethnicities that live, in this portion of Germany that now has become Poland, will be brutally deported by the Poles from their territory. And there are some claims that the Poles, after the Second World War, may have murdered as many as 500,000 Germans in this violent expulsion of Germans from their territory now, former territory now occupied by the Poles. And again, considering what the Germans did in Poland and to the Polish people, it's not a surprise of the kind of vengeance that was wreaked. So there is a kind of a satisfaction among all the islands, among all the allies, at the end of the Tehran Conference. Almost everybody gets what they want, except for Churchill. He is somewhat dissatisfied on the issue of Poland and its future. And Stalin wants a stronger commitment on the issue of the Turkish Straits. by September of 1944, Operation Bagration, that had been again launched in June, has Soviet forces now pouring into Poland and into other former Nazi allied countries' territory, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. The Red Army is now fighting into that territory. And the relations between Stalin and the London Poles are only getting worse. And so as Operation Bagration begins to come to an end in August of 1944, it begins to lose its momentum. Kind of the operational objectives of Bagration are now completed. The Red Army finds itself just across the Vistula River from Warsaw, the capital of Poland. And now there's a disaster in the looming. On August 19th, the Russians stop outside of Warsaw. They begin to regroup, rearm, resupply, preparing to push into the next stage of the campaign against the Nazis in Poland. And now we have this unfolding scenario that historians are still debating exactly what happened to this day. As the Russian army stops outside of Warsaw, the London Poles now give the order to the AK in Warsaw to seize the city from the Germans before the Russians get there. And this approximately 6-week battle for Warsaw now begins between the AK and the Nazis. The issue here is why exactly are the AK doing this? And there's two different scenarios. One scenario is kind of the Paris model. You may remember that the Allies intended to bypass Paris. Paris was not seen as a strategic target. And the Nazis, in the meantime, before withdrawing from Paris, were preparing to just destroy Paris. They were going to plant explosives around all the monuments, the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe, the Invalides, so far, the Louvre, and we're just going to blow Paris up. And so the French resistance now rises up in Paris and kind of forces now the Allies, especially the Americans, to turn away from their objective of outflanking Paris and now turn and strike at Paris to essentially liberate Paris from the Germans before the Germans can destroy it. So that's one scenario. Is the AK actually rising up to lure the Russian army into deploying into Warsaw to save it before the Germans can destroy Warsaw, as they tend to be doing that throughout, especially Eastern Europe, as they're forced out of occupied territory? That's one scenario. And of course, the Russians don't do this. They just sit there doing nothing as the Poles rise up and fight this bitter battle, the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. And don't confuse this with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of the previous year in 1943. That was a small uprising in the Jewish ghetto of Warsaw as the Germans were preparing to liquidate it completely in 43. The Jews will rise up there and fight the German army. But this is the entire city of Warsaw rises up. And Poles are being slaughtered, but the Russians just sit there. And so the other theory, of course, is that the AK uprising was not about luring the Russians into Warsaw, but was about seizing control of Warsaw and taking it as the AK, the Armia Krajowa of the London Poles, of the Republic of Poland in exile. They wanted to take control of the city before the Russians do and consolidate the London Poles' control over the capital, the former capital, or the capital at that point of Poland, as far as the London Poles were concerned. So, which is it is a subject of debate. And the issue, of course, is whether Stalin now chose to deliberately sit there on the other side of the river and watch the Germans essentially destroy the Polish resistance with kind of this massive force that the Germans unleash, including all these new weapons that the Germans had developed by 44. Here you can see these robot explosives that are designed to fight against troops who are using rubble as a defense, as the Germans learned from Stalingrad. This was a way again of sending these just these mini tanks loaded with explosives to defend fortified positions. This is Warsaw in 1939, the Prudential Insurance Company building, the tallest building in Warsaw. This is what the Germans are going to do to it in 1944 during the uprising. Warsaw is completely destroyed. And again, the Russians just sit there on the other side of the river. Approximately 25,000 AK soldiers, Polish soldiers, resistance fighters will be killed, and some 150,000 to 200,000 Polish civilians are killed in Warsaw. Some of them just randomly, summarily executed by the Germans, who, of course, considered the Poles as an Untermensch, a lower life form that they were going to kill off anyway and were attempting to kill off. And so at the end of this, nothing is left of Warsaw when the Germans finish with it. Here you can see aerial photographs of Warsaw shortly after the Russians had geared up again and crossed the river. The Russian defense of this theory that Stalin cynically just sat back there and allowed the AK to burn itself out is, first of all, Operation Bagration was indeed a massive operation that had run its course by August. And before the Russians could be ready to engage a fortified German target like Warsaw, which was, as I say, heavily defended by the Germans, that they needed that time to resupply, and that it would have been suicide to send the Russians just at the end of Operation Bagration now to fight their way into Warsaw without being reinforced. The other thing that Russian defenders point out is that how would we have known that the AK would have lost against the Germans? There is no reason for us to think that the AK might not have taken the city and maintained control over it. So this idea that we sat there, this idea is predicated on that we sat there in the knowledge that ahead of time that the AK was going to lose against the Germans. And it was a tough fight for the Germans indeed. On the other hand, of course, we have the psychopathology of Stalin, and for Stalin to have just sat there cynically to allow the AKs, the London Poles AK, to be destroyed is not out of the question either. He was entirely capable of having cynically decided to do that to advance the interests of the Lublin Poles, who of course are accompanying the Red Army as it is advancing towards Warsaw. And so nothing in the Soviet archives that were released to historians in the 1990s really resolved this question, whether this was a cynical decision or not. But of course, often, perception of something becomes the reality, and that's the way the London Post now in the future upcoming negotiations are going to regard the Russian decision to not liberate Warsaw in the moment that the AK rose up. Warsaw is essentially a rebuilt city today. And so now the Russians are pushing into Poland. They're, as I say, pushing into former Nazi allied countries' territories, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. They're pushing towards Yugoslavia, where Tito's partisans, and Tito is a communist, Tito's partisans are fielding entire armies. They're not just guerrillas, they actually have armor, they have artillery. And so Churchill now becomes worried exactly what's going to happen there now, as the Red Army is essentially the only allied army in those territories, and those territories are not being liberated, say, in the way France might be, or the Netherlands from German occupation. Those territories are enemy territories, and how exactly is Stalin planning to treat them, and what's their future? And so Churchill wants some kind of understanding now with Stalin of what the Russian interests in Eastern Europe are going to be now. And so in October of 1944, Churchill now flies to Moscow by himself, without Roosevelt, for a one-to-one meeting with Stalin. According to Churchill's own history of World War II, when he meets with Stalin, he tells him, quote, "Let us settle about our affairs in the Balkans. Your armies are in Romania and Bulgaria. We have interests, missions, and agents there. Don't let us get at cross purposes in small ways. So far as Britain and Russia is concerned, how would it do for you to have 90% predominance in Romania, for us to have 90% in Greece, and we go 50-50 in Yugoslavia?" And as this is being translated, Churchill begins to sketch out on a scrap of paper from his notebooks these spheres of influence, as they become known, between the Soviets and the British, and presumably with US consent, which they would wield in the Balkans and in Central Europe. And on this scrap of paper, Churchill now writes out Romania, Russia 90%, others 10%. Greece, Britain 90%, in accord with the USA, Russia 10%. Yugoslavia, 50-50. Hungary, 50-50. Bulgaria, Russia, 75%. The others, 25%. Churchill writes, quote, "I pushed this across to Stalin, who had by then heard the translation. There was a slight pause. Then he took his blue pencil and made a large tick upon it and passed it back to us. It was all settled in no more time than it took to set down. After this, there was a long silence, The penciled paper lay in the center of the table. At length, I said, might it not be thought rather cynical if it seemed we had disposed of these issues so fateful to millions of people in such an offhand manner? Let us burn the paper. No, you keep it, said Stalin. And so that paper Churchill kept, and it ended up in the British archives. And there you could see the original with Stalin's check mark in blue pencil, which he loved to use. He had a kind of a normal pencil, a red pencil, and a blue pencil that he would use. And for example, he would, when approving strategic things, he would use a blue pencil, or death lists. For example, when you look at death lists presented to Stalin, you often see that blue pencil check mark, and there it is. Romania, Russia, 90%, others 10%, and so far added later in hand in accord with the USA. Yugoslavia 50-50, Hungary 50-50. All these things are actually going to be changed after this penciled note. It's a great story that Churchill tells, and certainly we have that piece of paper now, how they kind of sat down and divided up Europe together over cocktails. But, Churchill tends to gild the lily somewhat. He kind of emphasizes the drama, which makes him such a great writer. Churchill's histories are very readable. According to the British ambassador's notes who had witnessed that scene, the British ambassador reports, quote, Churchill produced what he called a naughty document showing a list of Balkan countries and the proportion of interest in them of the great powers. He said that the Americans would be shocked if they saw how crudely he had put it. Marshal Stalin was a realist. He himself was not sentimental, while Mr. Eden was a bad man. He had not consulted his cabinet or parliament. That's the British ambassador's memo on that meeting. The Soviet diplomatic record is a little bit more solemn, but almost the same. Soviets write, quote, Churchill announced he had prepared a table. The thought that was expressed in this table might be better stated in diplomatic language because, for example, the Americans, including the president, would be shocked by the division of Europe into spheres of influence. Very much what the British ambassador says. Later in the conversation, Churchill returned to this issue, saying that he had prepared a rather dirty and rough document which shows the division of influence of the Soviet Union and Great Britain in Romania, Greece, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. In response, Stalin said that the 25% envisioned for England and Bulgaria did not harmonize with the other figures in the table. He considered that it would be necessary to enter an amendment envisioning 90% for the Soviet Union and Bulgaria and 10% for England. And in fact, several days later, the so-called percentage agreement is adjusted to 80-20 in favor of the Soviets in both Hungary and Bulgaria. Nobody really knows what these percentages meant, but and of course this so-called percentage agreement later, of course, will be attacked by critics as a cynical ploy by the British and Russians to divide Europe up between themselves. Churchill will defend this percentage agreement, saying that it protected Greece from seizure by the communists. And the problem of course, in Greece is that the official Greek army and the monarchy surrendered, and the Greeks also went into exile. And the only resistance in Greece was the communist resistance, the Ilas Iam partisan movement. And so once the Germans are expelled, and this was still before the end of the war, from Greece, the communist resistance intends to become part of the government. However, the British of course, are worried about Greece and its proximity to both the Dardanelles and to the Suez Canal, again, in the Mediterranean. Greece has always been considered as in the British sphere of interest, and the Russians, Stalin, agrees to that. And so the British now, along with the help of the Americans, begin to reinstall the old monarchist regime in Greece and begin to disarm the resistance by force. And so the resistance, having fought to the death against the Germans, now find themselves fighting the Greek monarchy that is returning, as well as the British troops that are occupying and attempting to disarm the resistance. And they begin massacring the former Greek resistance movement. And so Greece now goes into this civil war in which hundreds of thousands, if not a million, Greeks are going to die. It's going to go on right into, I think, as late as 1947, 48. And the Ilas Iam in Greece is calling on Stalin to help them, and Stalin is refusing to support the Greek communists. He's tells them that, quote, our Greek friends will not be able to count on active assistance from Moscow. In other words, Stalin remains loyal and compliant with the percentage agreement that he had made with Churchill, to the point that the Greek Communist Party is essentially exterminated in this Greek civil war that is not only backed by the British, but eventually the Americans, as 1945 comes, get into Greece as well. Murder Incorporated in Greece. It's a huge tragedy for the Greeks. This loyalty to the percentage agreement is something, again, an other element of the future Cold War that Stalin is going to decry, that as he occupies Romania and Hungary and Bulgaria, liberating them from the Nazi governments in the same way as the Allies are entering into Greece, liberating them from the Nazi government there, that there's a double standard as to the question. He's not asking whether the Allies are instituting a democratic system in Greece. What right do the British and Americans have to ask the Russians whether in their sphere of interest they're establishing a democratic government, and whether they're doing something untoward in those countries? It's a bit of a hypocrisy that certainly Russians to this day point out, especially in these last 20 years under Putin, as he's attempting to restore Russia, make Russia great again, as he likes to say. And so this becomes an issue. As Churchill leaves, Stalin, de Gaulle is standing in the wings. De Gaulle, of course, in the summer, in June August of 1944, as the Allies land in France. Now you have the French resistance. We have this notion of the French resistance fighting throughout the war. Maybe the communist parties in France, especially after 1941, when the Nazis become enemy of the Soviet Union, the communist parties in France certainly fought in the resistance in the same way as the Italian communists fought in the resistance in Italy. In fact, in Italy today, the word for partisan, partigiano, and partisan associations, associazioni di partigiani, are synonymous with the word communist. There were very few non-communist. There were some, but very few non-communist partisans or resistance fighters in Italy, and the non-communist resistance in France was minimal until the Allied boots hit the ground at Normandy in 44. And then, every Frenchman kind of flips over their portrait of Hitler with de Gaulle on the other side and claims I was in the resistance. Most were not. Most were lackeys of the Nazis, in the same way they were in North Africa when the French were happily killing American soldiers landing on the beaches there. And so de Gaulle, of course, in the summer of 44, after the invasion of Normandy and D-Day, is escorted by Churchill into liberated Paris, that the Americans liberated, that an alliance of Free French and communist resistance fighters in Paris had seized. And then once Churchill escorts de Gaulle into Paris at the Arc de Triomphe, Churchill then stands aside, lets the cameras roll, and allows de Gaulle now to march down the Champs-Élysées from the Arc de Triomphe to press images of the Free French army liberating Paris. And de Gaulle now wants to claim that he was the legitimate representative of France all along, not the Vichy French. That France has always been an ally of the British and Americans and the Russians, that they deserve at the seat at the table where all the spoils of Germany are going to be divided, and that France should not be treated as an enemy state, but in fact as a ally that in his person they always were from the beginning. Roosevelt will have none of that. And of course, de Gaulle needs, Churchill is behind de Gaulle, and Churchill desperately is trying to convince Roosevelt of that. Roosevelt, of course, as I say, is not particularly fond of the French after, all those American troops in North America were killed by the French. Moreover, Roosevelt has interests now, as I say, in Vietnam, in Indochina, which the Vichy French very happily handed over to the Japanese during the Second World War. When the Japanese said, we want this territory, the French said, of course you do. You're welcome to it. And in the same way that the French and Nazis together were administrating, Casablanca, Morocco, Algeria, and so forth, they were doing the same in Vietnam and Cambodia. The Japanese and the French ruled there together. And so the Americans find themselves fighting along with the Vietnamese resistance against the Japanese. And here you have the Vietnamese resistance along with some of the OSS American officers. The OSS is the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor agency to the CIA. And here you can see some of the Vietnamese agents working with the OSS against the Japanese in the jungles of Vietnam. In particular, between these two OSS officers on the left, you see Ho Chi Minh, the future leader of North Vietnam and the war against the United States, some 15 to 20 years after this. And on the right here, this guy, around whom this OSS officer has his arm around his waist like a high school girlfriend at the prom, is General Genjap. General Genjap, of course, is the architect of the Tet Offensive. He's the architect of the destruction of the French at Dien Bien Phu in the 1950s, and one of the great generals of the 20th century, in fact. He slaughtered the French. He humiliated the Americans. Now Vietnam's General Giap faces his final battle. His final battle, by the way, was a battle with cancer, which Giap actually won that as well, having not only defeated the French, the Japanese, and the Americans, defeated cancer. He lived to the age of 101. About 5 years ago, actually, was the funeral for General Giap in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. But that's another course, just an interesting aside from the kind of twists and turns that history sometimes takes and the things we forget. Very few of us are aware, especially those of us who grew up in the Vietnam War era, that Ho Chi Minh, actually, America's enemy in Vietnam, was actually working with the Americans as an OSS agent, fighting the Japanese, and was allied. And Ho Chi Minh, in fact, lived in New York for some time and in Boston, and was a great admirer of the American Constitution and the American Republic, until the Americans, of course, under Eisenhower in the 1950s, will betray Ho Chi Minh. So de Gaulle has certainly problems. It doesn't look good for de Gaulle in terms of getting the Americans on his side. He needs at least two of the big three, to endorse de Gaulle's Free French, to be recognized as allies and, I say, given a seat at the table in the division of spoils, and for France to be able to hang on its colonies. Of course, he realizes that Roosevelt and Stalin intend to strip the French of all their colonies around the world, including Algeria. Indeed, if Roosevelt and Stalin got their way, we probably would not have had the Algerian War of the 1950s. We would not have had the Vietnam War. Those are very realistic scenarios if the French were treated as the enemy that they had been. But goes to Moscow in December. If he can't get what he needs from Roosevelt, maybe he can get it with Stalin. And so Stalin and de Gaulle meet, and Stalin certainly is also in some ways indifferent to the question of the French. Remember, Russia and pre-Second World War France were in an alliance, so Stalin does have some memories of being in alliance with the French before Vichy France came into existence. And Stalin asks de Gaulle, if the Soviet Union endorses the Free French as the official representatives of France right from the beginning of the war, and the Vichy France instead are now regarded as kind of rogue renegades who never represented France and its empire around the world, its colonies, as legitimate rulers, what are you going to do for Russia? And de Gaulle kind of shrugs his shoulder, and what can possibly France do for Stalin? And so Stalin now puts this before de Gaulle. Well, if France becomes an ally, you know, who would France recognize now as a legitimate exile government representing the Polish people? The Lublin Poles or the London Poles? De Gaulle, of course, says, screw the London Poles. Of course, we always recognize the Lublin Poles as the official legitimate representative of Poland. Bang, deal done. And Stalin now, in exchange for de Gaulle's endorsement of the Lublin Poles, who are being seated now as the government in Russian-occupied Warsaw, will sign off on the recognition of the Free French as the official representatives of France all along. And now, with Stalin and Churchill on board, Roosevelt's resistance, of course, is irrelevant. The two of them outnumber Roosevelt. And so that's how France is going to be removed from the enemy list, and France will now become one of the official allies of the United Nations and will get a seat at the Security Council table as a permanent veto power in the United Nations, which the French ridiculously hold to this day, and will never, of course, let go, despite the fact that France has become kind of a minor second-rate power. It nonetheless has a veto in the United Nations today. And of course, all those colonies that were going to be stripped from France will be now returned to France. And of course, as soon as Japan falls and the North Vietnamese declare independence, not the North Vietnamese, the Vietnamese declare independence, the French now march in to Vietnam and reoccupy it, and the war for the liberation of Vietnam begins to be waged by Ho Chi Minh. In fact, he's actually waging it against the Japanese, restarts to be waged against the French in 1945. France will also now get a chunk of Germany. As you can see, the French zone, bordering there in the south of Germany on the US zone. Germany will now be divided up between the four powers. And the French, of course, are now included in all the deal making, and the French as well will have a piece of Berlin, as Berlin, as you can see from this map, is deep inside the Russian territory. There'll be three corridors through which Western zone Germans can travel and communicate with Berlin, but Berlin is in the heart of Russian territory, the Russian district of occupied Germany, and Berlin is likewise divided between the Russians in East Berlin and the French, British, and Americans in West Berlin. And in the 1960s, under Khrushchev, a wall will be erected just around West Berlin, dividing East from West, but that's much later. But that's how the French become our allies.